How to Sew the Square Dance Quilt by Amber Makes. Make this beautiful quilt based on the original Tennessee Waltz quilt. It's so much simpler to make than it looks. Follow me and I'll show you how to make an heirloom quilt to be proud of. Cutting out. So take all the fabrics either from your kit or if you're using your own fabrics and label them. A and B are your two dark toned fabrics. C is your one mid-tone print. And then you've got D, E and F that are your light tone prints. And obviously all of the measurements for these are given in the instructions for how much fabric you need of each of the prints. So whether you're using the kit or you're creating your own quilt, choose these tones so that you get the right effect and do label them. Now the instructions tell you exactly how to cut everything out, and most of the quilt is cut from the sub-cutting method. So you cut a strip across the width of the quilt of the fabric that I've done here. And then the instructions will tell you how to then sub-cut these. When you do that, lay your strip on your cutting mat so it's nice and straight, and then trim off the selvages because you don't want those in. So just line up the ruler with the straight lines on your mat and just trim off the selvages, and then follow the instructions which will tell you how big to cut each piece. Some of the strips will be cut later, particularly those that are used for the tri-rectangles, and some of the pieces are cut into individual pieces now. If you look in the instructions, they are all labelled, so they tell you exactly how big to cut each piece. So write the name of each of the pieces onto a piece of paper, or you can type them out, it's up to you, or just photocopy that page and cut them out. But do label all of the pieces as you're cutting them, because I find it a lot easier to cut out all the fabric before you start and then put it all into piles and then you know what's what. But do double check as you're cutting that you're cutting out the right size pieces. There is a little extra allowance on the fabric in the ingredients list for you to be able to cut strips and make sure everything's nice and straight. But do double check as you're cutting that you cut everything into the right pieces. So this is just showing you how you subcut a strip and then cut it into the sizes you need. So I've just labelled this one. So those are my simple star block HSTs dark. So then cut the remainder of all of the fabrics into these pieces. So this is fabric A. And those are all the pieces that you'll need. So the tri-rec ones, they're cut into strips now, but they will be cut into the right size shapes later on as you're making the quilt. And you've got all the pieces here for the inner borders, and the fabrics have been chosen so that you've got the right tones. That means that the pattern of the squares and the stars and the circles will show up. And you also, from some of the fabrics, you'll be cutting binding strips. And then fabric B, you've got some centre squares, you've got some pieces for the chain star blocks. And some little border squares that are used right on the edge of the quilt just to pull the design and the prints through to the outside from the inside of the design. And then this is fabric C, so this is your one mid-tone print. So there's the chain star block centre squares, you've got star points, lots of those, so I've put those into 3 different piles. And then fabric D, so this is one of your light toned prints. So this is what you're going to be using for your HSTs, and you'll be using them for side squares and tri-recs, but just label them all as you go and put them into piles. If you've got a lot of some of the pieces, then you can clip them together rather than pin them, but just pin the label to the top and then clip them all together, and then just keep them together like this in groups. It is much easier if you cut out everything before you start, because then if you're making the quilt over a period of weeks or months, then it's much easier when you dip back into it to find what you need. And this is one of the other light fabrics, and you can see I've cut some binding strips from that. And then the final light print, this is used for the outer borders. So those are all the strips that are used for that. And this is just what frames the edge of the quilt and pulls in the light and the dark together, but it is predominantly a light coloured print. So once you've cut out all of the pieces, put them together in sections. So take out everything that says simple star block at the beginning of it, because you're going to be making one set of blocks at a time. So you can see you've got a variety of prints here. So group them now, put everything together that's used for the simple star blocks. Then group together everything that's used for the chain star blocks, but I've labelled them so that it always says the name of the block at the beginning and then what the piece is. So chain star block, centre square, so that it's always got the name of the block at the beginning. So group everything together for the chain star blocks, and it's much easier to work on one section at a time, particularly when you're making a big quilt like this. And then here are all the pieces that are for the inner borders, because these have some tri-rectangles in as well. And then the strips for the inner borders, you've got squares, short strips, medium strips and longer strips. So again, do make sure that you label everything, and it's so much easier then when you come to put the whole quilt together. So that's all the inner border pieces. And then these are the few pieces that are just for the outer border. So you've got all of the strips, and then you've got some squares and some rectangles. So pop those to one side. And then you've got your binding. So the binding is made from 2 different print fabrics that's joined together later. Making the simple star blocks. We'll start by making the HSTs. Take all the pieces that you've put to one side for the simple star blocks, and you need to take the 2 HSTs pieces, the light and the dark. All the other pieces you can put to one side for now, because you'll be making those pieces later. So you need to make half square triangles, and we're going to make these in groups of 8. It's quicker and more fabric efficient to do that. And in order to do this, you need to take one light square, put the others to one side for now, and one dark square. And then just pop the other dark squares to one side. Now take your light square and place it so that it is wrong sides up, like this. So right sides down. And then on the wrong side of it, draw a diagonal line that goes from one corner to the opposite corner. Now I'm using a heat erasable pen for this. You can do it lightly in pencil because you'll be cutting along these lines later. But heat erasable pens are quite good because you can just press them and the mark disappears. So draw your one line, and then draw another line from the other corner to the opposite corner, and then these 2 lines will cross in the centre. Now take your dark square and place the dark square and the light square so that they are right sides facing. So you can see you've got the drawn lines on top, place them right sides facing and match up the raw edges all around. They're exactly the same size, so they'll match up, and pin them together. Now you're going to be sewing 1/4 inch either side of these lines. So place your pins away from the lines, and then you won't have to remove them when you sew. So I'm just going to put some near the edges, and then I'm going to put a few more just closer to the centre. This just holds it into place. Now these pins I'm putting across the lines. I will have to remove these as I sew, but because these are quite big squares, it just helps to stabilise it, because you're going to be sewing 4 seams in total. So these you'll have to remove, but this just helps to keep all those layers together. Now once you've done that, sew 1/4 inch either side of both lines, and this means that you'll be sewing 4 seams in total. So once you've done that, it will look like this. So you can see I've sewn my 4 seams, and now I can cut the squares into 8 pieces. So to start with, cut along the drawn line, the diagonal lines, which means that you'll be cutting between the 2 seam lines. And because you sewed 1/4 inch either side of it, you've then got a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Turn it round, don't move the fabric, you move the mat, and that's because you want to keep everything nice and butted up together, and you'll get more accurate pieces. A rotating cutting mat is ideal for this because you can move the mat, but if you don't have one, just move your normal mat, or just you move yourself around to the other side. Once you've cut along both the lines, now cut vertically down through the centre. Line up the top of your ruler along the top straight edge of the fabric, and make sure it runs through the centre where those lines cross, and cut along that. And then for the final cut, turn it round again and cut vertically through the centre. Again, make sure you line up your ruler with the top raw edge and that your ruler goes right through the centre. And then cut along there And with these 4 cuts, you've now divided your 2 squares into 8 triangles. So you can see I've just pulled them apart here. You've now got 8 triangles. Now if you open up the triangles, I'm just going to take my pressing mat, open up the triangles and they become squares, which is a half square triangle. So open them up so the fabric, the seams are facing towards the darker fabric, and give them a press. And then they'll be nice and flat. But make sure the seams face towards the darker fabric, because then they won't show through. And then repeat that to press all of your half square triangles open, and then they will look like this. So there's all 8 of them. They're not exactly the right size because we're going to trim them to make them absolutely perfect now. Now we need to trim them into 4.5-inch squares. So put the diagonal line on your ruler along the seam line and make sure that you've got the same amount. If you can see where the 4.5-inch mark is on your ruler, make sure you've got a little bit to the right and a bit to the left and at the top and bottom. Cut along the right hand side and along the top, and that will just trim those 2 sides, and then turn it around 180 degrees, and then on your ruler find the 4.5-inch measurement, match that up at the bottom and the left, and then trim off the top and the right hand side, and then they will be a perfect 4.5-inch square. So by trimming them to be exact, it means that when you make your blocks and put them into your quilt, you will have perfect squares. And this makes it, by cutting them this way, you will have a more accurate finish. And repeat that with all of the 8 half square triangles, so you've got perfect pieces which will make joining them up easier later. So now you know how to make 8 half square triangles at a time from 2 squares of fabric. Now repeat that with the remaining 8 half square triangles light and the 8 half square triangles dark, to make 8 from 2 pieces of fabric. And sew them together, cut them, trim them, and then you will have now 72 simple star HSTs, which is enough to make all 18 of the simple star blocks that we'll be doing in a moment. So just pop these to one side. Making the side squares. So take the simple star block side squares and the simple star block star point squares, and to make one side square you need to take one of the side square and 2 of the star points, and just pop the others to one side. So turn the 2 star point squares over to the wrong side and draw a diagonal line going from one corner to the opposite corner. And then repeat that with the other star point squares. So there's your drawn lines. Now place one of the star point squares in the bottom right hand corner of your side square. They need to be right sides facing. Put them in the bottom right hand corner. Make sure that diagonal line is going from top right to bottom left and that the raw edges match up of these 2 fabric pieces. It's important that the line goes across the corner. So top right to bottom left. And then sew the pieces together along that drawn line. And then it will look like this. Before we trim it, fold the star point square over so that the corner of it meets the corner of the side square, and this means it will lay accurately. And then open up just the top layer and trim the seam allowance of the 2 bottom layers to about 1/4 inch, and this just removes the bulk. And then because you folded it over to trim, just press it back into place just to hold it. Now place your side square this way up and take the other star point square and pop that in the bottom left hand corner. So you can see that the diagonal line is going from top left to bottom right, and you can also see that it overlaps the other star point square a little bit, but that is what the seam allowance will be when you join these squares in later. So sew along the line, remember it must go across the corner. Fold that star point square over so the corner meets and the side edges meet. If you don't fold it over before you trim the seam allowance, sometimes it can be a bit skewed, but by pressing it over, that just pulls it into the right place. Trim the seam allowance of the 2 fabric pieces underneath, and you can discard those, and then fold it back over. And that is one side square finished. So you've made little points on it, and these will be the points of the stars. Now you need to repeat this with the remaining side squares and the remaining star point squares. So you can do them one at a time, or you can do it as a production line by drawing all the lines and then sewing on all of one square and all of the other, or you can just do one at a time. So you pile them all up and you will have 72 side squares, which is enough to make all 18 of the simple star blocks. Assembling the simple star blocks. So take all the pieces that you've already created, and to make one simple star block, you're going to need one of the centre squares. You'll need 4 of the HSTs that you made, and you will need 4 of the side squares. So just take these from the piles of all the blocks that you've already made. Now you need to lay these out right sides up in the arrangement that I'm showing you here. There is also a diagram in the instructions showing this, so you can either follow what I'm doing here, or you may find it easier if you lay all of these pieces out and have the diagram in the instructions next to you. So you can see by laying them out in this order, that centre square is in the middle, and those side squares are now creating the star around the centre square, and the half square triangles are in the corners. So that is one simple star block laid out. So join all the 3 squares together in each row. So you've got 3 squares in the top row, so just pin those together. And then pin the other one and sew that. So make all of the rows first. And then once you've done that, it will look like that. And press the seams in opposite directions. So 1 goes one way, row 2, middle row goes the other way, and row 3 goes the other way. It just helps to nest them. And then sew row 1 to row 2. And because you've pressed the seams in opposite directions, you can nest the seams by pulling one seam just gently across the bottom seam, and then they will butt up because of the different heights of the seam allowances. It just makes it easier to match up if you've pressed the seams in opposite directions, because they butt up nicely. So pin together at the seams first, then pin them at either end, because the more the seams match, the better your pattern will look. But don't worry if they don't match perfectly. Just try and get them to match as much as you can, and then sew the middle row to the bottom row. And then it will look like this, and that's one of your simple star blocks. I pressed those seams open just because there was quite a bit of bulk there. And that's the simple star block finished. And now you need to repeat this with the remainder of the centre squares, the half square triangles, and the side squares. So repeat that to make 18 simple star blocks in total. And this is what you need for the whole of the quilt, of these blocks. So make all of those, give them a good press, and then put them to one side for assembling the quilt later on after you've made the next set of blocks. Making the chain star blocks. So we're going to start by making the tri-rex. And to start off, you need to cut the centre triangles. So these are all the pieces you're going to need for the chain star block. So you've put all those together already. So you've got the pieces for the 4-patch, you've got the centre squares, the tri-rex side triangles, and the tri-rex centre squares. So now you've got all of those pieces together. Trace the templates that are in the instructions. So these are the quilt templates. And then if you stick them to a piece of card, it just makes them a little bit more solid and stable and easier to draw or cut along. So we're going to start by cutting out the centre triangle. So you've got strips of fabric. There are 5 strips of fabric for this. Take one of the strips, and it's already folded in half, because if you cut it across the width of the fabric, you'll often cut that in half. So do fold it in half, and it just means that you can cut 2 centre triangles in one go, which saves a little bit of time. So you've got the 2 selvage edges together. They're wrong sides facing. Make sure, just rearrange it to make sure that the raw edges match up, and pop them on your cutting mat. I'm just double checking that it's all lining up together. And now I'm just going to cut a straight edge just to remove those selvages because I want to make sure that they're not in my triangles. Then take your centre triangle and place it on top. So the height of the strip is the same as the height of the triangle. So place the triangle a little bit, just about 1/4 or 1/2 inch in from the left-hand side. Now you can cut along this triangle, but I find it easier, more accurate to draw a line. Now you can draw all the way along, or you can just mark the top and the bottom place. It's up to you. If you're going to use your ruler, you can just mark the top and the bottom. I found that if I cut along the triangle, with some of them I ended up cutting into the card a little bit, and then the template is incorrect. So if you draw either all the way along or just a little mark at the top and the bottom, match those up with your ruler, cut along one side. You can move that strip out of the way now if you like. And if you've got a rotating cutting mat, you can turn it round and cut along the other side. Once you've done this a few times, you'll find that you'll be able to cut the pieces without turning it round. But after the first triangle, you'll only be cutting one side anyway. So that's one of the centre triangles cut. But because you've got 2 layers, you've cut 2 in one go. Right, now take your strip back again and put it on your cutting mat. Now, because you've already cut one diagonal line, make sure the lines are matching up. Take your template and turn it round so that you've got the long edge at the top and the short edge at the bottom. And because the angles are the same on either side, you can just match that up. And then you can draw along this line, either draw all the way along or just mark the top and the bottom. And then you can then cut along this line. And that's another pair of centre triangles cut. And then you just keep repeating it. And all you have to do is keep turning the triangle round. So it goes up one way and then you turn it the other way and you cut all the way along the strip of fabric. So just make sure that your raw edges are matching up and that the cut line that you've just cut matches up with the line. If you find as you're going along that it's not square anymore or it's not matching up at the top and bottom, you can retrim that left-hand side by moving the triangle in a little bit. So cut all the way along and it will look like this. And then that little piece that you've got left over, if you open that out, you can get one triangle from that piece. If the crease of the fold is really defined, then do press that first to remove the crease. But with this piece, I would cut it just like you did with the first one by drawing along one side and then the other side. And that means that you'll get 15 of these triangles from one strip of fabric. So 7 pairs and 1 extra. So that's all the centre triangles cut from one strip of fabric. Now you need to repeat that with all of the other strips of fabric to cut them all in exactly the same way. And then you will have 72 centre triangles, which is enough for all of the blocks. Cutting the side triangles. So take the Tri-Rex side triangle strips and your side triangle template. Now each of the Tri-Rex has a right side triangle and a left side triangle, so it's really important that with these that you cut them in pairs so that you have one that's the mirrored image of the other. So you'll keep your strip folded in half, just like you did with the centre, but even more important that you must always cut these in pairs because the triangles face in opposite directions in order to make the Tri-Rex. So start off by cutting off the selvages to cut a nice straight line, because this is actually going to be the first side of your triangle. So make sure it's at right angles with the top and the bottom, and you can remove that. Then take your triangle template and place that long straight side up against the cut side. The top and the bottom of the triangle will match up with the top and bottom edges of the strip, and then draw a line. Again, you can just mark at the top and the bottom, or you can draw all the way along. So place your ruler so that the lines meet up and cut through both fabric layers. And then if you have a look now, you've got a pair, and you've got one that faces one way and one that faces another way. So you've got a right side and a wrong side. So you always cut these in pairs. Now turn the triangle round so that the long edge is at the top and the short edge is at the bottom, and the diagonal side is exactly the same angle. And then mark that straight edge. And then place your ruler there and cut them out. So I think this is easier than trying to cut along the card template, because you're not trying to hold the template in place. It's just, you're just marking it, and it's easier to hold it with your fingers and mark and then cut. And there's another pair. So you need to continue in this way by turning the triangle each time to cut all of the side triangles. So that's all the pairs of side triangles that are cut from that strip. And then you need to repeat that to cut all the pairs of triangles from the remainder of the strips. And once that's done, you will have 72 pairs. So 72 right sides and 72 wrong sides. So put all of these to one side, and then we can start assembling the Tri-Rex. Sewing the Tri-Rex. So take all of the side triangles you've cut and all of the centre triangles. Now to make one of them, you'll need one centre triangle and then one pair of side triangles, so a right side and a wrong side. Now just place these right sides up just so you can see the orientation and the layout. So the short side of the centre triangle is at the top, and the short end cut off points of the side triangles at the bottom. So it will look like this. If you just lay it out, I just find it easier so you can visualize what's going to happen. Now you need to make some marks on the bottom edge of the center triangle, just 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom. So just make a little mark at one side. These are positioning marks, so you can see that's on that longer straight edge. Now take the right side triangle and place it right sides down on top, and that bottom point needs to go at the 1/4 inch mark, and matching up the raw edges, pin it together. So basically this right side triangle, you're positioning 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom of the center triangle, but by marking it, that mark in advance, it makes it just a bit easier. Pin it into place and then sew these two together, and then open it up, press the seam over towards the side triangle, and then it will look like this. So you can see how it fits beautifully, and that the top and the bottom match up in a nice line. Now you've got your 1/4 of an inch mark, so take your left side triangle, place that right sides down on top, and again match up the bottom edge, that bottom point of the left triangle, with that 1/4 of an inch mark, and then match up the raw edges and then pin it together all the way along. And then sew the two pieces together. Then open it up, press the seam towards the side triangle. It just means that the centre triangle will sit nicely and flat by doing this. And that's your Tri-Rex finished. Now, if you want, you can trim off you see the little ears that are sticking above the top? You can trim these off. I just put my ruler across the top and trim them off. You don't have to do this. They will sit within the seam allowance, but I think it just makes it a little bit easier to see what you're doing when you're constructing if you trim them off. But that is one of your Tri-Rex finish. It's quite simple to do with all the marking. As long as you mark the 1/4 inch, they're quite simple to do. So sew them all together, and then you will have 72 Tri-Rex in total, which is another one of the squares that you're going to be using in the chain blocks. Making the 4-patch squares. So take the two sets, so you've got 4-patch square light strips and 4-patch square dark strips. Now you've cut these across the width of the fabric, but you've got 9 of each, 9 lights and 9 darks. Now, when you sew long strips together, sometimes they can skew out of shape, or banana as some people call it, and I find it easier if you cut these in half. So where you've got the fold of the fabric on one side, just trim off that fold, and then you're cutting them into shorter strips. And this just means, because you're going to be sewing a light to a dark, they won't start stretching out of shape, which can happen when you sew narrow, long strips together. They're also easier to deal with. They're easier to sew and press and cut if they're a bit short. So repeat that with all of the dark strips and all of the light strips to cut them all into half. And then you will have 18 light strips and 18 dark strips. So to start off with, take one light strip and pop the others to one side, and then take one dark strip and put the others to one side. Now place one dark strip and one light strip right sides facing. Make sure that top long raw edge matches up. And I also like to match up the selvages a bit, just so that the selvage of one is in the same place as the selvage of the other, so that when I trim it, I know I'm trimming through both of them. So just make sure that that top long raw edge, you've cut them to the same width to start with anyway, so they will be the same size, but just arrange it so that the raw edge matches up. And we're going to sew it together and then cut it. Again, this I'm trying to show you with this quilt quick and easy ways to do things. So by sewing this together, open it up and then press the seam allowance towards the darker fabric. If you always press the seam allowance to the dark fabric with all of these strips, then they're easier to join together later. So rather than cutting lots of squares, we're going to cut 2 long strips and cut them into squares, and that does save a lot of time. It's also a little less fiddly to make as well. So now you've got your squares, your strips together, make sure that the top strip lines up with the line on your cutting mat. So you can see I've got it along there. And we're just going to trim off the side edge, just so it's at nice at right angles. So if you make sure that your ruler lines up with the straight lines on your mat, then you can make sure that this is at a nice right angle. So you only need to trim off a tiny bit. It means that you're starting with a nice straight edge. Now we're going to cut these join strips into smaller strips. So we're going to cut them into 2.5 inch wide strips. So line up the 2.5 inch mark on the left hand side and then cut along. And that's called a 2 square set. So I'm going to move my rule over to 5 inches and I can cut 2 without having to move the fabric. So there's 2 of your 2 square sets, and then just repeat that. So again, 2.5 inches, and just keep cutting all the way along. It's a good idea at some points to line up one of the horizontal lines on your ruler with the seam line, and then you know that you're cutting it straight. If it goes off at all, just trim the very edge of the strip, just like we did right at the beginning, just to make sure that it all stays at right angles. And there you've got all of the 2.5 inch 2 square sets that you've cut from that strip, and then those little bits at the end, you don't need those, you can just discard them. And then repeat that to sew all of the strips together in pairs, and then subcut them all into these 2.5 inch 2 square sets, and then you will have lots of 2.5 inch square sets like this. I like to do mine as a bit of a production line, so I sew all of the strips together and then I cut them all. Now to make them into the squares, the 4 patch squares, take 2 of them and place them right sides facing, but so that the same fabrics aren't touching. And because you press the seam allowances towards the dark fabric, if you slide one across the other, those seam allowances will butt up or nest together, and it means it's a lot easier to match them up. You don't have to try and pin them together properly. You can just butt them up and then pin them, and sew those 2 together, and then it will look like this. If you open that up, I've pressed this seam open just because there's quite a lot of layers, particularly in the centre, so I've pressed the seam open and flat, and that is one 4 patch square. So you now need to repeat that with the remainder of your 2 square sets. Join them all together in pairs, making sure that the fabrics are opposite. You haven't got the same fabrics touching. And then you will have 72 4 patch squares in total, ready to go into your finished quilt when you make the chain star blocks. So just pop those one side. You can put the label on if you like. Assembling the chain star blocks. So take all of these squares that you've made. So you've got your 4 patch squares, your tri-rex, and then you've also got centre squares. These are ones that you've just cut, not created. Now, to make one chain star block, you need a centre square, 4 tri-rex and 4 patch squares. So take all of these pieces. Remember, this is all listed in the instructions, so you can double check against that. Put all the others to one side. Now, you need to lay these out in the arrangement that I'm doing here. There is also a diagram in the instructions of this, so if you prefer to follow the diagram and put that next to you on your work surface, then you can follow that. It's really important that you get everything the right way up. So with those 4 patch squares, it's important that the lights are going the right way and the darks are going the other way. But if you line them up like this, you can see that centre square is now surrounded by putting the tri-rex around it, that makes the points of a star very elongated, sharp points. But this is what will create that circular pattern on your quilt. So make sure it all looks like this, that you've got the light squares radiating towards the centre, you've got the tri-rex facing the right way, and check it against the diagram as well. Join all the pieces, the 3 squares together in the top row, then join the 3 squares together in the middle row, and then join the 3 squares together. Make sure you pin them together and then sew them together. And then this is what it will look like. You've got the 3 rows, so I've pressed the seams in opposite directions. So row 1 goes one way, row 2 goes another way, and row 3, the bottom row goes the same way as the top row, and that just means that you can nest the seams. So place the top row and the middle row together. Again, slide the top seam over the seam below, and it will just stop because of the different in heights of seam allowance. They'll just nest together, pin them together at the seams. If you can try and get these seams to match up as perfectly as you can, then the pattern will look better, because these tri-rex are what create the circles on the quilt. If they don't match up exactly, it doesn't matter, because you won't really notice once the whole thing's done. But I just find if you pin it together at the seams now, you've got a greater chance. I'm pinning together at some of between those seams as well, just because you've got a lot of fabric and things can start moving, so I find it easier to pin it all together. So sew the top row to the middle row, and then sew the middle row, right sides facing, to the bottom row. And again, match up those seams first before you sew. And then this is what one of the chain star blocks looks like. I've pressed those 2 seams open and flat, so you've got that nice star shape in the centre. Now you need to repeat this 17 more times, because you need 18 chain star blocks in total. And we're ready to start putting the quilt together now. Joining the blocks. So you've now made your 18 simple star blocks and your 18 chain star blocks. So we're now going to join them together. If you have a look at the quilt layout diagram, it shows you what order to put them in. Basically, they alternate. So you'll notice that in the odd number rows, they start with a simple star block, and the even number rows start with a chain star block. So place them one beside another. And just like we did when we joined rows together before, make sure you match up the seams of the adjoining blocks and then sew them together. So there are 6 blocks in each row. So do one row, pin together 1 row at a time with 6 blocks, and make sure they alternate and make sure that they're facing the right way. And when you've sewn them together, label the rows. I just find that a lot easier when I'm joining them all together. So there's row 1, it goes simple chain, simple chain, simple chain. And always keep checking that you've got everything in the right order. There's row 2. Row 2 starts with a chain star block and then goes to a simple star block. Row 3 starts with a simple one. Row 4 starts with a chain. Row 5 with a simple. And row 6 with a chain. And if you label them like this, it does mean that if you come back to your quilt several weeks or months later, you know where you are and what row is what. And even if you're doing it all in one go, it's a lot easier when you're joining it all together if you know which row is which, and you can see which way up they go as well. But do always refer to the quilt layout diagram in the instructions, because that will help you. Now, once you've created all the rows, you can then join them all together. So obviously you join the bottom of row 1 to the top of row 2. So place them like this, and again place them right sides facing, and make sure that you pin together at the seams so that you're sewing the squares together. So pin together, because each of these blocks has obviously 3 of the squares across, so pin together at each of those seams so that everything matches up nicely, and then sew them together. So there's row 1 sewn to row 2. And then you can attach row 3, 4, 5 and 6. I found them easier. I did them in pairs. I joined row 1 to 2, then 3 to 4, and then 5 to 6. And then I joined those together. It's just a bit easier. You've got less bulk if you join them in pairs first. So you can see now how that circular and star has been created by the use of the Tri-Rex mixed with the half square triangles. That gives you that circular illusion when really you've only got straight lines. But it works so well and is very effective, and now you can see it's much simpler than it looks. Making the inner borders. So the inner borders are made and sewn around the outside of your join blocks. Take all the pieces that you put to one side earlier for the inner borders. So you've got the side triangles, the centre triangles, and then these border strips. There are different sorts, long, medium, short and squares. Put those to one side for now, because we're going to start off with creating the Tri-Rex. Now there are Tri-Rex in the inner borders because this is just our take on the original Tennessee Waltz quilts. By putting them into the borders, it continues the pattern, and I think it makes it quite effective. So you need to cut out the centre triangles and the side triangles. These are done in exactly the same way as you cut out the centre triangles when you were making the Tri-Rex for the chain star blocks. So I'm just going to show you again. Place the centre triangle on the strip. It's folded in half here. And make your mark at the top and the bottom, or you can draw all the way along and then cut along it. I'm just showing you this again just as a reminder, but it is exactly the same process as you did when you made the Tri-Rex squares earlier. So just cut along that edge. And then that has cut one pair. So you've now got 2 centre triangles. Turn it around so you've got the long edge at the top and the short edge at the bottom. And then cut along that line. As long as you keep all the fabric nice and still and hold the template still, you will get perfect centre triangles. And then repeat that, and you need to cut 12 centre triangles in total. So I've got 6 pairs here, so you need 12 that will go into the inner borders. So just pop those to one side whilst you cut out that piece there is spare. Now we're going to cut up the side triangles, and again these are cut out in exactly the same way as you cut them for the Tri-Rex for the chain star blocks. So line up the strip. It's folded in half just like before, because we're going to cut them in pairs, because you have to have identical right and side so that when you open them up they're mirror image. Cut a nice straight line that's at right angles with the rest of the strip off the end, and then take your side triangle template, line up the left hand side of it with that cut edge, draw a line at the top and the bottom, and then put your ruler against that line, and then you can cut. So that's one pair, and you've got a right side and a left side, because you need that to complete the block. And then take your template, turn it round just like before, so you've got the long edge at the top and that cut off short edge at the bottom. Mark the long edge of it. And then you can cut along there. So that's another pair of side triangles. And then repeat that all the way along. And you need to cut 12 pairs in total, which means you will have 12 right sides and 12 left sides. So once you've got all your side triangles, oh, that piece is a spare piece, you won't need that one. Take all of your centre triangles and then you can create the actual tri-recs, which are done in the same ways as you did with the tri-rec blocks. So take one centre triangle and one pair of side triangles, so you've got one right and one left. Make sure the short, blunt cut-off edge of the centre triangles at the top and the blunt cut-off edge of the side triangles at the bottom, and lay them out again just to remind yourself how it's going to be joined together. And then it's much easier to make sure you've joined the right piece to the right piece. Mark along that bottom edge, 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom edge. Just make a little mark at either side. And then place the right side triangle, right sides together with the centre triangle, matching up that bottom point with the 1/4 of an inch mark, so that the side triangle starts 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom. And then pin it together. But you'll remember this, you've already made 72 of them. So I like to just make them in sections like this. It just makes it easier, because I know a lot of people, particularly me, when you make a quilt, you don't make it all in one go. You might make it in little bits. So this is why I cut and sew the tri-recs for the inner borders separately to the chain style blocks, and then you just make one section at a time. And then once you've sewn the right side on, sew the left side on. Make sure it's 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom, matching up with that mark. And then always press the side triangles over towards the side triangles, and then you've got a nice flat back centered triangle. And then repeat this to make 12 tri-recs in total, which will be pieced inside the inner borders. Now, in the instructions, it does list the order in which to place all these pieces to make your inner border. So double check that you've got them in the right order. So take all the inner border rectangles and squares and all the tri-recs. So we're going to start by making the right side inner border. That has a medium rectangle, then it has a tri-rec, and you sew that. Make sure the points are facing outwards towards the right, like this. Then you take a long rectangle and sew that to the bottom of that tri-rec. Then take another tri-rec, make sure that the point of the triangle faces outwards towards the right. Then you take another long rectangle and sew that. So we're sewing these together, because this is the right side border, in one long vertical strip. Another tri-rec, and then you finish it off with an inner border square. So sew those together all into one long strip. And when you'll see in a moment that although these tri-recs seem to be spaced in strange places, and why you've got long rectangles and medium rectangles, it means that they're spaced specifically so they will join up with the blocks on the quilt to continue the pattern. So that's the right side border, and I've labelled it right at the top so that I remember. So place that right side facing down the right hand side of your joined blocks. I'm just going to pin it into place so I know that it's in the right place. And you can see now how that tri-rec matches up with the simple star block to complete the pattern into the border. Because otherwise what you will find if you don't do that, it gets cut off and that you don't have the final point, which is fine. It's different, depends on the design you want, but I wanted my star shapes to continue into the border. So pin that all the way down the side. Make sure that the tri-rec seams match up with the simple star block seams as you do this, and pin it into place and sew it all the way down. And that's what it will look like. So that's the right side border attached. So you can see how it's continuing in, so you complete that star shape. And because you've got the light fabric as well against the dark fabric, it's even more striking that shape continues. So you now need to make the left side border. Again, follow the instructions. It will tell you what order. I've sewn mine together in advance. So obviously you've got a mixture of different border squares, long rectangles, medium rectangles, tri-rects. Make sure the points of them face outwards towards the left. But just look at the instructions. I have listed them all there in order. And then once you've made the left border, you can make all the borders and then sew them all on. I just found it easier to know where I was, to sew a border, sew it on, sew a border and sew it on. So you can see, make sure when you sew it on that you match those seams so that star shape continues into the border. So that's what it looks like when it's joined on. So you can see how now the star shape, it comes out. Because this fabric on the borders is the same fabric that's in the half square triangles and the tri-rects, it really does complete the pattern. Here's the top border. Again, this is formed from a mixture of rectangles and squares and tri-rects, but again the instructions list the exact order and it's much easier to follow that. Once you've created the top border, then sew that across the top. So you start across the top of the left border and then move, and you can see how they match up, and do make sure that you pin those seams together so they match up. So there's the top border in place. And you can see I've made sure that the right hand side of the top border matches up exactly with the right border. And then finally you need to make the bottom border. Again, follow the instructions to see what order everything is placed in, and make sure that the points of those tri-rects face downwards. You'll soon know when you sew it on if they don't, and if you get them the wrong way around, which I did once, you can just unpick them. But do try and make sure that with all of these borders that the points of those tri-rects do face the right way. So they need to point, they're always pointing away from the main quilt. So there's the bottom, and you can see how that tri-rect continues into the border. So that's what it looks like when the bottom border is. You've now got all of your simple star blocks and your chain star blocks surrounded by a nice dark coloured border which matches up with the other fabrics and really echoes all the prints that are in it, and also it makes the star shape continue into the border, which gives it a nice wide finish, and I think makes the finished quilt look so much more attractive. Making the outer borders. So for the outer borders you need outer border squares, outer border rectangles and outer border strips. So these are just sewn all the way around the outside of the quilt, but we're going to create the borders first. Now the instructions will tell you exactly what pieces you need for which of the borders. So we're going to make the right side outer border first. You need a strip, a rectangle and a strip. So if you take one of the strips, and I'm going to label mine so that I can make them all. So this is the right strip, so I cut these all out. I have lots of labels where you can just write on a scrap of paper, and if you label it, it's so much easier, particularly if you're going to come back to your quilt later. And then you take a rectangle and sew the two short ends together. And the reason I'm joining these is it means that I think sometimes it's nicer to join border strips with a fabric in between them, rather than just joining them. You can obviously just join two strips, but these borders are longer than the width of fabric. But it's nice, I've put a little piece of the red fabric that's used within the rest of the quilt, and it just gives a nice little finish. So join those three pieces together, and that makes the right side outer border with just that little rectangle in the centre. And then the left border, so I'm making all my borders in advance this time rather than sewing them on because I've labelled them as well. So there's the left one, and again that's exactly the same, that has the rectangle in the centre. And then for the top border, this is made with a square, a strip, a rectangle, a strip, and then a square. And then for the bottom border, it's exactly the same. It has a square, a strip, a rectangle, and a square, because those squares will be going into the corners. So start off by sewing the right border to the right hand side of all of your joined quilts. So the right hand side of the right inner border. So place that right sides facing and sew it together. Now, because this is quite a long strip, I find it easier to fold and find the centre of my inner border, and then to find the centre of my outer border, I know it's the centre of this rectangle because that's joined between the two strips. So just mark that up. I think when you are sewing two long strips together, it's easier if you anchor them in the centre and pin them, and then you can pin them either side of that. Trying to sew two long strips together when you haven't got any seam matching to do is quite hard to get it even. So if you do it in the centre and then pin it at either end, you can then pin between. You can divide it into 4 if you prefer. So that's the right side border on, and I've pressed the seams towards the outer border. So that goes all the way down with that little rectangle in the centre. And then I've also sewn the left side border because that's done in exactly the same way. So there's the left side border. I've kept all the labels on for now just so that it might help you to see what part I'm pinning it to. Obviously you might take yours off as you go along, but sometimes, particularly to show you can see what's going with what. So there's the top border. Make sure you match up the seam of that square with the top of the left side border. Again, I would divide it in half. When you pin it all together, it will just make it a lot easier. And sew that into place. And it will look like this. So there's the top. You can see I've matched up those seams. It goes all the way along with that little rectangle in the centre. And then I've made sure I've matched up the seams on that end. And then going down to the very bottom, I've also sewn the bottom border. Again, make sure that square, the seams of the square match up nicely, and then sew it all the way along the bottom. Again, dividing it in half and pinning and sewing is a lot easier. And that just gives you, it frames the quilt because it's quite a nice fabric, that too. Gives a bit of light and a bit of the dark to frame the whole quilt. And then this is what it looks like. I've laid it all out on my kitchen floor because I thought it might be useful to see what it looks like when you've joined it all together. Now you can see the circles and the stars that have been created by just straight lines. It's like magic. But your quilt top is now finished. Finishing and binding your quilt. So I'm going to start off by showing you how to make the binding. So you've got 2 different prints of binding strip because I wanted mine to look a bit like a scrappy binding where I alternated them, but just using 2 fabrics. Now to make it scrappy, I want my strips to be shorter than a full fabric width. So they're still folded in half because that's how I cut them from the fabric. So trim off the selvages to start with. And then where you get to the fold of the fabric, so you can see it's 2 layers, where you get to the fold of the fabric, keep it folded, but just trim off that fold, and then that divides it into 2. So you've now got 2 strips, but I want these to be shorter. I think that's too long for a scrappy binding, so I'm going to fold that in half again. And then if you just lay your ruler on top, cut through all those 4 layers, and that now divides that one strip that's cut across the width of the fabric into 4 equal pieces. And I think it's about 10 inches, and it's quite a nice length if you're joining them together to be able to see it without too many joins. And then repeat that to cut all of the dark binding strips and all the light binding strips. You've now cut them all into 10-inch lengths. So to join two of the strips together, obviously we're going to alternate them. Place one strip on top of the other. I've placed the dark on top of the light. Match the top and the side raw edges and just make a little mark where it met the strip below and draw a diagonal line from the top left corner to that mark. Now place the dark strip back on top of the light strip, match up the top and the side raw edges, and you can see that diagonal line now goes from the top left to the bottom right, just where the strip below meets it. Pin either side of that line, and then you won't have to take out the pins when you sew, and sew along the line. And then it will look like this, so it's like an L shape. Open out the seam allowance and press it flat. And then trim the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch, just to remove the bulk, and then press it open again. And joining it together diagonally means that when you fold it around the edge of the quilt, the bulk of the seam allowance is spread across rather than all be in one place. And actually, I quite like the diagonal effect of them joining. Repeat this to join all of those strips together, alternating them into one long length. And there's enough here to go all around the quilt because I calculated it all. Now I'm going to do a double fold binding for this quilt to make it nice and strong. So fold this whole strip in half lengthways with wrong sides facing and press it. Press it all the way along, making sure that those long raw edges match up. Because when we bind the quilt, we'll be sewing it together in a double layer like this. Because it's extra strong, it's actually easier to bind as well because you haven't got to fold any edges under. You've got a folded edge to work with. So do that all the way along, making sure that the edges match. Then I've now got my quilt, it's backed, it's quilted, it's all ready to go. You can quilt this yourself. I have mine long-armed quilted. You can do it under the machine if you want, but once it's all quilted and ready, you can bind it. So to do this, fold it in half along one side edge, just to find roughly the centre, because I like to start in the centre of one side. And then mark that with a pin. Now, because I'm doing a double fold binding and I'm going to machine stitch it on, I'm going to pin the binding to the wrong side. There's a free PDF and video tutorial of how to bind a quilt on the Amber Makes website. So if you want more information and more detail about binding a quilt, and if you want to slip stitch your binding on or you want a single fold, go to the website and download that and watch the video tutorial. There's lots more detailed information that will show you how to do this and how to join the strips as well. So for this one, with the double fold, turn it over to the wrong side of the quilt, the back. Place one end of your binding at that halfway mark, doesn't have to be exact, just part way down, and pin it into place, matching the raw edges of your binding with the edge of your quilt. And then measure 4 inches down from the top of the binding, about 4 inches. This is just what I'm going to leave a little bit left unsewn so that when I join it together it's a lot easier. And then start stitching from that point so that you're leaving about 4 inches unstitched. And then continue, then stitch it, pin it and stitch it all the way down that one side of the quilt. As I say, this is on the backing fabric side because I'm going to fold this over to the right side of the quilt to top stitch it into place. If I was going to slip stitch, I'd be doing it the other way around. But again, do read or download the how to bind a quilt and it will give you a lot more information. So start stitching from there, stitch all the way down until you reach the bottom, and then stop stitching 1/4 inch from the bottom and then stitch diagonally into the corner. Fold the strip upwards so that the raw edge is level with the the side of the quilt, and then just pin that into place. And then fold it back over again so that the fold meets up with the top edge and the raw edge of the binding meets up with the right vertical side. Make sure that that fold matches up exactly and the right hand side matches up. Give it a press to hold it neatly into place, and this is what's going to create your mitered corner. It might look a bit odd, but you will create a mitered corner by doing this. And then pin it into place. And then you sew it into place all the way down and do the mitered corner at the other end in the same way by stopping 1/4 of an inch before the end and sewing diagonally into the corner, and then doing the folding process that I've just shown you. So do that all the way around. So there you can see there's the 4 corners, and then join the 2 ends. You can either overlap them or join them diagonally. And again, if you have a look at the Amber Makes How to Bind a Quilt tutorial, that shows you the joining process as well in detail. Once you've sewn it all into place, before you fold it over to the right side, fold that binding strip outwards and press it. That just means that it'll be laying nice and flat. If you turn it over and don't press this outwards first, sometimes it's not laying flat. So once you've done that, turn it over to the right side of the quilt. And then take that binding and fold it over so it just covers the line of machine stitching that you've just worked. And because we've got a double fold binding, it means you haven't got to fold any edges under. You've got a nice folded edge. So it's a lot neater way of doing it. If you were going to slip stitch it in place, then you could just slip stitch now, but I would do that on the back of the quilt, so work the other way round. So once you've got it covering, it only needs to be just covering it, pin it into place, and then to get that corner nice and neat, if you fold it over like this, then it just naturally forms into a mitre. And on the other side, it will be a mitre as well. So just pin that into place, just adjust it, but by folding it upwards and then over the other side, and then continue all the way around like this, so that the folded edge of the binding, and you can see those nice diagonal joins of your scrappy binding, and then top stitch close to the edge all the way around the quilt to hold that binding into place. And then it will look like this. So there's your quilt beautifully bound in matching fabric. With those nice diagonal joins of the binding, it really echoes the fabric that's in the quilt. It's nice and neat on the back as well. So you have now finished the square dance quilt. You can see it's a lot easier. It looks more complicated than it is, with all of its curves, which aren't really curves, and this beautiful fabric as well. So enjoy. Put it on your bed, and it will last you a lifetime. Your new heirloom quilt.